In the first three parts to this five-part series, I talked in some depth about what a point of strategic control is and what we call the carrot in the stick, namely vertically aligned incentives, what that means, and some examples of both. In the third of the five-part series, I talked a little bit about why and provided some evidence that this is material to firm performance. It matters. In the book that you see here, The Carrot and the Stick, that really is much of, obviously with a lot more detail than I did in the previous videos, the subject of the first, probably about half of the book. The second half of the book, which is what really matters, is how do they take those constructs of an industry value chain, a competency map, strategic control, vertical aligned incentives, and actually do them in your industry to create an ecosystem, interconnected value chains, points of strategic control that you can leverage not just to your core industry, but across industries is how good companies win today. The ability of Alphabet to gain revenue from the insurance industry in Latin America just because they had the infrastructure in place and the foresight to think about having Google Maps on the phone and getting data vis-a-vis the Android operating system are examples. So leveraging strategic control in one market to another with foresight is what good companies do today, not only succeed, but to create an ecosystem. We want to think about platforms, not products, and ecosystems, if you can, in beyond platforms. To illustrate how good companies do this, how companies do it, I'm going to give a quick story and show a brief video. It's the CEO Summit in New York, the Yale Summit. Jeff Sonnenfeld runs it, does a masterful job a number of times each year. And in the audience, there were about 250 top CEOs and a handful of academics and business people like myself. But the audience was generally comprised of the leading business thinkers of the day. 250 of them in a room in New York. I was privileged enough to be there. One of the people in the room was Larry Page, and it was before he stepped down as CEO. And the subject of the conversation being moderated by my colleague Jeff Sonnenfeld at Yale was, what would companies do if corporate tax rates were lowered in the United States vis-a-vis the Tax Reform Act of 2017? This was December of 2017. What would the companies do that had cash abroad with the money they would bring back home? And in front of this group, with everyone watching, Jeff went to Larry Page, who was in the room, said, "Hey, Larry, as co-founder of Google and CEO of Alphabet," he's since moved on from that role, of course, but at the time he was still CEO, "you have," and I forget the number, I think it was something like $33.6 billion overseas. If you could bring that $33.6 billion back to the United States, what would you do with that money? What would you think? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, you name it. You would think of like Internet of Things. You go on for a while, what it might look by. He said traffic lights. The answer was traffic lights. He said, literally, this is exactly what he said. He said, "I'm sitting in my office in Mountain View. I look out the window and I see my workers wanting to come to work and they're stuck at traffic lights. No one's moving. I called up the city of Mountain View and said, and asked them, who's responsible for traffic lights? And they said, oh, no one is. We subcontract that out." He says, "I want to solve the traffic light problem." Twice in the next 10 minutes, Jeff asked him two other questions that had nothing whatsoever to do with traffic lights. And he was obsessed with traffic lights. His answer to both questions was traffic lights. Why do I tell this silly story? Well, he wasn't talking about traffic lights. He was thinking 8 steps ahead. He was thinking about the ecosystem that would be created when this is in place. All right, silly video, of course, but hopefully you get the point. He wasn't thinking about traffic lights. He was thinking about what if we had a world that didn't need traffic lights, when all the vehicles are interconnected and talking to one another. A lot of people talk today, for example, about do we need to build infrastructure and build new roads and congestion on highways, even post-pandemic. We actually may have too many roads. We just use them inefficiently. There are some studies that suggest that we actually have too many roads were vehicle travel to be interconnected and autonomous. Larry Page wasn't thinking about traffic lights. He was thinking about what if we had a world without traffic lights because we didn't need them anymore, vis-a-vis that silly video you just saw. So when you think about taking a point of strategic control in your core markets and leveraging it to multiple markets, that's what we talk about in the courses you see here. That's what we talk about in the second half of the carrot and the stick. This is material to firm performance, as I suggested in the third of this 5-part series. It matters, it's real, it's relevant, it's rigorous. Get the core right. Get the points of strategic control and vertically aligned incentives in the core, and then think about how you extend it to an ecosystem and leverage a point of strategic control like Alphabet has done flawlessly across the world and across time. How do you do it for your industries? How do you gain that competitive advantage that we want you to win over your rivals? It matters.